anybody wants it, I'll give you the code. It took me 10 minutes to actually program my phone, but it does work. Well, can I welcome everybody, particularly the away team, who are almost outnumbering us. This is the first meeting that we've held in 2 years. Our last scheduled meeting was the 25th of March 2020, and we had to cancel it on the 16th of March when Boris Johnson, although he put out the guidance, try not to meet, don't go to parties, don't do anything like that. But it only became law on the 26th, the day after we should have held the meeting. But we thought it sensible to actually cancel as soon as the announcement was made. And during that time, we've existed doing webinars, the majority of which have been run by Keith Turner, and those that haven't been run by Keith Turner have been run by Keith Phillip. Both ably assisted by their glamorous assistant Alana, who unfortunately is not here tonight. But one of the initiatives that we've had going during the interregnum was that Keith very kindly rose to the challenge of becoming the industry liaison officer, which is a particular thing that I've had a vision of for about the last 20 years, and we've never really managed to get off the ground. Keith has really put a great deal of effort into it, for which I'm really grateful. And the first fruits of his effort are this meeting tonight, and making contact with you guys in Mintivo, which unfortunately our chairman isn't here, John Cooper, but John was saying the other day, if we've got one company that we're in contact with, John counts that as success. But I think Keith will be looking for quite a few more as well. So you're groundbreaking. But I've said enough, and I'm going to hand over to Keith to both introduce Dave and also just say a very little bit about what a splendid job he's done as ILO.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Yes, I'm Keith Turner, and as Jeff said, I'm the Industry Liaison Officer for this branch. So what does that mean? What is Industry Liaison? Well, we're trying to connect the branch more closely with technology-enabled, technology-led companies in the county. For what reason? Why would we want to do that? Well, we think there's a two-way or a symbiotic relationship we can develop here. Certainly there's something in it for us as the branch, because we get fantastic speakers to come onto these events and tell us about the great things that your team are doing. But also I think for you, it raises the profile of your organisations. You can use it, for example, to raise ideas about new opportunities, new solutions you're developing, but I think you can also use it for your team, for continuous professional development. So you could bring your team members along, get them to present to an audience outside of the organisation they're perhaps not used to speaking to. So I think there's a two-way street here. We can, yes, get interesting speakers to speak at our events, but also use it for your organisation. We can also help you navigate the BCS. We're aware there's lots of service offerings available within the BCS. You might have questions about those offerings, and we can help point them in the right direction to connect with people in the organisation. We're not trying to sell anything. We don't mind if you're members, if you're not members. We're really just trying to connect with those interesting organisations in the county. So as Jeff said at the beginning, the first fruits of that process, I'm very delighted to welcome Mintivo here tonight, and Dave Merrill, who's going to tell us all about why data culture eats strategy for breakfast. I'm sure it's apologies to Peter Drucker, but I'm sure Dave will talk all about this exciting topic over the next 30 minutes or so. Dave, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me as well. It's great to come to your first kind of in-person event in the last couple of years. Obviously, it's a shame there's not more of us to show for it, but I guess that's the kind of sign of the times. People are taking a bit of time to kind of build up confidence again around COVID and things like that. So hopefully this will be great for you guys to be able to start putting on in-person events again and gradually growing that again, which would be fantastic. So I only started at Mintivo in December, and my background before that was in really largely in the public sector and education sector, so big, quite clunky bureaucratic organisations. And they both had two things in common really. One, their kind of senior leaders all talked a good game around data. They said they had aspirations of wanting to use it and get into BI and analytics and things like that. But the other thing they had in common was that none of them were actually very good at doing it. For whatever reasons, the aspirations never really translated into reality. And I've spent a lot of time over the last few years thinking about why, having been in roles in a couple of places where I've kind of left quite quickly when it's become apparent that actually those aspirations weren't going to be met. And the biggest reason that I can come up with is that actually it's linked to organisational culture. This idea that you can have this aspiration about wanting to use data and BI, and you can have all the technology in the world which exists now, but if you haven't got fundamentally the right kind of attitude and approach and understanding of how to use that tech, but also how to engage with data more broadly, you're on a bit of a kind of hide into nothing really. So the focus I want to talk about this evening is really just picking that apart a little bit, trying to understand why data culture is important in the first place, and actually the kind of risks and issues that it raises for organisations if they don't have a good data culture, and then actually talk a little bit about what people can do, or IT professionals particularly, to try and drive a kind of change around that positively in your own businesses. So first of all, why does it matter? What is data-driven decision-making and things like that all about? What are the benefits of having this stuff? I don't know if any of you have seen this before. A lot of people look at this model and say it's a bit outdated now as technology's grown and so on, but I really like it still because it kind of gets to the heart of why using data to inform your business is important and kind of what the main benefit is. So you start at the bottom with your kind of raw data down here. So you've got kind of like a colour code and some coordinates, but they don't mean anything. You know what they are, but you don't know what they represent. So you have to put meaning against it and turn it into information. In this case, you're driving towards, there is a red traffic light on the high street. And the problem I've found is most organisations I've worked with kind of stop at that level where they're being informed, but they're never really taking their data to the next step. They know what's happening, but they don't bother really to investigate why it's happening or what's driving it. And that only starts to happen when you move up to the next level and start putting your own context around it, which is that you're driving towards a red traffic light. Now it's interesting, now it's useful to you, because you can then apply that knowledge that you need to stop your car. So for me, this just captures nicely that idea of actually translating and kind of processing your data into something that actually has some meaning in your business and can be useful to you to make decisions. And this is what I don't know if you've heard a guy called Clive Humby famously said, data's the new oil. And lots of people think he's just talking about the fact that it's very valuable, companies like Facebook, people like that who basically survive and profit only on the use of data. But I think he's actually referring more to this idea that it's valuable in itself, but actually it only really becomes truly valuable when you process it and refine it and turn it into another product that actually serves some purpose for you. So that's kind of the main kind of game in town in terms of benefits and positives from having a good data culture, is that you get to take your data and use it properly. But the big problem is that it's all the risks that are associated with not having a good data culture that actually probably override even some of this stuff. So I want to just talk through a few of them now. You've probably heard the classic adage of there are three types of lies: lies, damn lies, and statistics. Well, kind of misinformation and misrepresentation of data is a really big problem in businesses where data culture is poor. So I just want to use a quick kind of advertising example just to highlight what I'm talking about. So Colgate got in loads of trouble for this back in the, I think it was like the mid-2000s, claiming that more than 80% of dentists recommend their toothpaste. And it's not that it's not true, but it's heavily caveated in reality. So they got in trouble because actually there's this kind of implication to a statement like that, that actually people recommend it above any other toothpaste brand, for example. Well, what really happened is they've done a survey and just asked a load of dentists, tell us a load of toothpaste brands that you'd recommend, and it happened that 80% of them mentioned Colgate in passing. And interestingly, at the inquiry into this, it turned out that one of their rivals actually were recommended by more dentists. So it's kind of, it's that thing that it seems like a very clear-cut statement, but actually it's quite ambiguous when you understand the detail behind it. The other example I guess I want to use was around politics, where I don't want to trigger a debate on this subject, by the way. I'm conscious I get told off by my wife a lot for doing that, so I'm not going to do it today. But I just wanted to put this example up just because it's in the news in the last couple of weeks. Boris Johnson was making claims fairly outrageously that employment levels were actually higher now than at the beginning of the pandemic. And he got a big slap on the wrist from the UK Statistics Authority, because that's only true if you exclude self-employed people. And the reality is there's actually over 500,000 more people out of work now than there were before COVID. So context is everything, and he did the same thing a couple of weeks earlier with crime figures. He said crime levels were going down, but only if you excluded fraud and computer misuse, which obviously, yeah, we all know during a pandemic are probably the two areas of crime that are probably going up the most, although I don't have the stats to back that up, just for the record. And I guess I wanted to share these examples because it just kind of highlights the power that data has, and actually, people engage with it. If you start spouting statistics and numbers and things like that, it has meaning and kind of resonance with people, because I guess otherwise, these people wouldn't do it, would they? We all remember things like the Brexit bus and things like that. This stuff is genuinely influential, so it's important that it's kind of treated with respect and not misused. Now, you'd hope in business, people's motivation to kind of abuse data would be less, but actually that's not always the case. And I think the reason for that is, we live in a very target-driven world. KPIs and metrics and things like that are all the rage. Now, if you're in a mature data organisation, people tend to use things like missed targets as a bit of a kind of learning opportunity. So it's kind of, what went wrong? How can we change it? How can we improve it next time? But I've worked in plenty of organisations where it's very much a stick to beat you with. If you miss your target, it's get a shoe in from the boss or whatever kind of thing. So you can kind of understand why people want to manipulate data and targets to show their performance being better. So it does happen in business as well, but if any of you work in kind of regulated industry, that can be really problematic. I worked somewhere, I won't name where, because it was quite serious, but somebody had been systematically actually tweaking their KPIs every month, and it happened to be about something that we were regulated on, and as a result our CEO ended up having to find himself a new job because we had to self-declare to the regulators. So, it is important stuff and it is serious, so it's important that businesses get it right. It's not just kind of misinformation that's the problem with data. It's not people actively or deliberately misleading people, it's when the data can be misleading in itself. Data quality is a massive challenge, and it's a big thing that's problematic for businesses that have a kind of low maturity data culture, because what you tend to find is if you don't have a kind of quite robust data culture, you don't really have any data governance. You don't have a lot of control or quality control around the data you're collecting. And again, for me, this goes back very much to kind of a cultural issue. So thinking about targets and kind of misinformation, I imagine like a contact centre or something like that, they're targeted on things like, how quickly do you answer the phone, how many minutes are you on the phone for, how many calls can you take in a day, that kind of thing. It's all very predicated around kind of pace and speed. But the problem with that is things then fall down gaps in between times. What happens between those calls? Alex, I know you guys work with a CRM system all the time. It's when in a call centre you get off the phone. What about when you're entering notes and capturing the information that you just talked about on the phone? If the big rush and the big drive is around get the phone down and pick it up again to someone else, that bit in the middle where you're actually collecting really useful, valuable data can go down the gaps. And that can be a problem. So it's kind of an issue of if people work too closely to what they're targeted on, you miss out on that kind of quality control that you get if people have the time to actually check that they're entering data well and doing the job properly. And another quick example of where that can be a lot more serious, on one hand, if you do it in a contact centre, you think, well, okay, there's a few small mistakes, there could be a problem when they get aggregated up, you can get a big skew in data and people end up making potentially wrong decisions, but it has more real-world implications as well. So I used to work in social housing, for example, and you probably remember the Grenfell Tower disaster, awful thing in 2016. Housing associations were, really, really focused on health and safety after that and trying to make sure they had all the governance in place around it, risk assessments, that kind of thing. We set a KPI for our health and safety team that 100% of all our communal blocks, flats and things like that had to have an up-to-date fire risk assessment. And they did exactly that. They worked to their target, but they didn't have a target that said they had to actually fix any of the problems they found. And it seems absolutely crazy to kind of say that out loud, that people would be so kind of blinkered and focused on what they're doing that they would not go and fix a load of really vital health and safety things. But that's exactly what happened, because I guess their boss and their boss's boss were all saying to them, success for you is have these risk assessments. So they did that at the expense of everything else. And we were lucky, we didn't have an incident, we just had an internal audit that flagged up that it was strange that we had these same high priority risks coming up every year and never getting fixed. But obviously that could have been the kind of thing that would have sunk the organisation had that actually been another repeat of something like Grenfell Tower. The other issue around maturity, I guess, is the idea of kind of effort and reward and kind of the value people get. When I showed you that pyramid diagram at the start, I kind of said people stop at that kind of information level a lot of the time, and that is these kind of like lagging metrics and KPIs of, you know, last month we sold 100, whatever it is, doodads or something, or, you know, customer satisfaction was this, which is all right to a point, but you can't do anything with it. The analogy I like to use is that it's a bit like cheering your team on and screaming at the telly like these people, but you're watching the football match on catch-up. You know, it's already happened, the results are foregone conclusion, and you can't impact the outcome of it. So, you know, you can talk about it all day long, but nothing's actually going to change. So, you know, these kind of metrics are one thing, that they're kind of lagging indicators. And I've sat in loads of meetings where people will say, oh, well, you know, whatever it is down from last month, and people kind of shrug their shoulders a bit, and it's like, well, oh well, we'll try harder kind of thing. Yeah, there's no real insight that comes out of it. And the other thing you get with that is this idea of, if you come across things like Vanity Metrics, you know, it's kind of like bragging rights stuff of, oh, you know, if you work in regulated industry, I used to work at University of Bath, and they were mad for their league tables. It's all, oh, well, we're 6th in the Guardian, and we're 8th in the Times. But so what? You know, it looks great on marketing, but it doesn't tell you why you're 6th or 8th. If you go down in those rankings, you don't get any understanding of what's actually happening behind it. So it's fine to a point, but what you tend to find is a lot of these things are very manual. People have to commit hours and hours of time to actually producing all of these metrics that really don't actually have any real value, you know, particularly in kind of low maturity organisations. So that can be a real problem. I've worked in places where you know, have managers that will say to me they've spent 2 whole days a month producing their KPIs. Yeah, that's like a month every year, which is a crazy amount of time, especially when you're working in something like a charity or a publicly funded organisation. But it becomes problematic, because if we want to fix our data culture and we want to make it more mature, you're going to need everyone on board. It's not something that you can fix individually. So if you've got a raft of kind of middle managers who get tasked every month with effectively wasting a day of their time to produce something that's not very useful, you get this real kind of apathy and ambivalence around that, and people aren't really that interested in committing to it. And equally, I'm not being funny, if I sat on a board, you know, imagine you guys on the committee for BCS, if you had a board pack every month, if you're on the board full of statistics that weren't very useful to you, I guess you'd probably start to resent actually having to spend the time to go through them every month, because you get nothing really tangible out of them. And again, they're the kind of people that you're going to be talking to wanting investment if you want to try and fix some of this stuff, and it's going to be a hard sell if you're talking to people who don't feel like they get any value from using data and using information within the business. So that's a bit of a bleak picture, but I kind of wanted to be cards on the table about all the problems we've got to solve, because it's really deep-rooted to try and fix these problems. You know, as I've said, there's kind of people who have got, you know, kind of really quite deep set and entrenched positions about data and whether it's useful or whether it's not useful. And you're going to need to try and kind of convert all of them to getting on board with it, or certainly a kind of critical mass of people. And the reason for my friends from the 80s here, I'm sorry, I do like TV throwbacks in my presentation, by the way, I should have warned you of that beforehand. Basically, it's not a one-person job, as I kind of said at the start. You are going to need like this kind of critical mass of people. You've got to get people on board and make it a team effort. So there's no kind of, I can rock up at work tomorrow and fix it. It's all about kind of influence and kind of getting hearts and minds on boards, I guess. The good news is data, business intelligence, you know, analytics, all of that stuff is now completely inextricably bound up with technology. So as IT professionals and IT leaders, that puts us in a great position. You know, while it isn't a single-handed operation to fix it, it puts us in a good position to actually influence it positively and do something useful about it. So what I want to really share, just for the kind of the last 15, 20 minutes or so, is some ideas about what we can do and how we can actually use technology and use our influence as IT leaders to start kind of driving change. Even if we can't fix everything, we can at least start building that critical mass and start getting kind of positive attitude towards data in our business. So I want to kind of work through the points that I've made previously and just pick them apart a little bit and look at how we can try and fix them. So the first one is this idea of getting value from data, because for me, the first step to getting people on board with wanting to do something about this stuff is to actually get them to recognise that there's something in it for them and something useful. So for all those lagging indicators we talked about, we want to look at something called leading indicators. So if you imagine you're Jeff Bezos here with his mates from the gym, you're interested in things like Amazon Prime, for example. You know, Amazon's all about subscriptions now. It's not, you know, it's the big game in town for them. It's lots of recurring revenue. So if you had a lagging metric, if you were Jeff Bezos, you might have something like how many Prime subscribers have I got at any given time, which is all right. You know, it's quite informative because actually you can equate that to revenue and you can get something from it. But what it doesn't tell you is what's driving that. Is it going up or down? If it is, you know, why? What's causing that? So you want to kind of pair it almost with a leading indicator. So I kind of always think about this, that your KPIs and things are effect, and leading indicators are kind of cause. So if you put them together, you've got a chance to influence the outcome. So for Jeff, a leading indicator for Amazon Prime might be something like, you know, the percentage of packages that are being delivered late, something like that. You know, people subscribe to Amazon Prime because other than a couple of TV series, basically they're getting their Amazon goods delivered the next day. So if you suddenly get an upturn in the number of people getting their stuff delivered late, you can predict quite reasonably that actually you might see an impact in the number of subscribers you've got because people are getting fed up with the quality of service. So by having that leading indicator, it kind of warns you in advance that there's going to be a hit on your bottom line and allows you to do something about it and actually make a difference, whether that's hire more delivery drivers or, you know, deal with a problem in your supply chain or whatever it might be. So having leading indicators is really important, and it can help you get in front of stuff. And that creates value because people can then look at that and say there's something in it, something tangible in it for the business. It's not just an IT person rocking going, oh, wouldn't it be great if we had? It's something that you can potentially put a financial value on, and that becomes more interesting to people then. The other bit about value was about the amount of effort that people spend, you know, to actually produce some of these kind of vanity metrics and lagging indicators and things like that in the end. And again, this is where as IT professionals, we've got you know, a bit of an advantage because we can help people actually try to automate some of the processes behind producing these high-level numbers. So they might not be that valuable, but people still want them, so you want to kind of get them with the least amount of effort possible so that you can focus your time on actually doing the important things of actually trying to influence the outcomes. So I always think with this stuff, you know, I've worked in places before where we've talked about things like data lakes and data warehouses and analytics and things like that. And I've always kind of tried to rein people in a little bit and get them to accept that you've kind of got to have the foundations first before you move into that stuff. It's a bit like you're trying to put the roof on before you build walls in some organisations that I've worked in. So I guess the thing that I'd, you know, kind of recommend is trying to start small with automation, if that's possible. If you're a business like all the ones I've ever worked in are always riddled with spreadsheets and things like that, so people have their structured systems, but equally you'll find there'll be some really pivotal business process where such and such has got a spreadsheet saved in their local drive that the entire business would kind of fall apart if it didn't exist. So for me, if you want to kind of tackle this stuff, it's about trying to pick off some of those kind of more niche cases first, where actually you don't need to kind of go cap in hand to the board and ask for a load of investment or a load of staff. You can use some of the tools that you potentially already got at your disposal to pick away at some small but actually quite valuable things. So if you use, for example, things like, you know, Power Platform and SharePoint and things like that, you could potentially start automating for people some of these painful little niche processes they have that are very important but take a lot of time and effort and actually aren't very robust. And the nice thing about that is, again, you kind of build value. You can show people what this technology stack around automation can do for you, because otherwise it can all be a bit kind of cerebral and conceptual and difficult for people to imagine, you know, what's in it for them. So start small and try and use some of the tools at our disposal to help people, and then you kind of find if you fix a couple of these smaller issues, you suddenly get a load of people knocking on your door wanting something similar, that have got similar problems that need solving. And once you've done that, you've got some kind of, I guess, some goodwill in the bank, where you can start to share with people who you might want to invest in bigger solutions, things like warehouses and things like that, where you can show on a small scale, it's almost like you've done a proof of concept, you know, this stuff does work and there's a tangible business value for it. The other thing about that I think as IT professionals we're slightly less good at is actually kind of bragging a little bit about what we do and the value of what we do. I think, you know, there's a bit of a habit in certain organisations where I've worked for IT to be a bit of a given and something that's taken for granted. You know, I think back to the University of Bath when the first lockdown happened back in March 2020. You know, the IT department were incredible. They kind of pivoted the entire structure of the university from lectures in a classroom to online teaching pretty much over a weekend. You know, and it was an amazing effort, and it did get recognised, but it's amazing after 3 or 4 weeks, it just kind of blends into the background and people forget this kind of almost superhuman effort that's been put in and just go back to, oh well, my Teams doesn't work, or you know, whatever it was that people were moaning about at the time. So I think people take it for granted, so we need to be very active about actually demonstrating the value of what we do and what technology does. And I think that's where those bits of automation, bits of project work that you can do for people to build up goodwill can be really powerful, because they're a chance not just to show that technology is great, but it's also a chance to get other people to talk about the benefits of technology to them as well. So to really kind of demonstrate the value that it brings. Because everywhere I've ever worked, I don't know about you guys, but I think I mentioned it to you when we were having coffee earlier, if an IT person says something in technology is great, then everyone goes, yeah, whatever. If one of their peers, someone in the business says it's great, then people actually start to really listen, and it becomes much more resonant with people. And this is really important because the next things we're going to talk about are all things that they're not about technology anymore, they're all about influence, and they really are about culture. So we'll come on to those in a sec. An example of doing this, I think, you know, IT people have got a great position here because we all work with people in our business, all over our business, day in, day out. You know, we go and fulfill their issues, deal with their technical needs, that kind of thing. So we spend a lot of time with people, and we spend time with people all over a business. So we can really cash that in and spend time building the relationships there as well, so that actually we kind of grow a level of advocacy where we're not the ones having to go and bang the drum about technology, you know, and get other people to do it for us. So for example, when I was at the University of Bath, when I first started there, I was just another guy who'd started in IT, and I had a couple of projects that I needed to do, and there were people who weren't very senior, but I kind of recognised that they were in teams that had a lot of connections out to a much broader range of people in the university. So as well as doing a good job on delivering their technical work, I spent ages, I invested so much time in basically like pressing the flesh, taking them for coffee, getting to know them, finding out what they did, making sure that I really, really delivered exactly what they wanted, and kind of sprinkling in my own ideas about getting value from it as well. So it was much a kind of hearts and minds thing as it was about actually delivering what they wanted technically. And the results were amazing. I felt like I was in some kind of pyramid scheme or something, because my boss moaned to me one day that she'd been to 7 meetings in 2 days and all she'd heard was people banging on about me and banging on about business intelligence and how great it was. So because I'd delivered for them, but I'd also taken the time to build that relationship and kind of almost establish a bit of a kind of personal brand with them, people were going out and advocating on my behalf. So all of a sudden I went from another in IT to I was getting calls from the Vice Chancellor about, oh, how can we use data to do this or BI to do that? And that then opened the door to much broader conversations where I needed their influence, you know, for much more difficult, challenging organisational things. So the first one of those things was data quality. We had terrible trouble with data quality at the university. We had some systems that were fantastic and actually quite well regulated. We had other stuff that, you know, we had 20,000 students in a spreadsheet kind of thing. It was, you know, very, very variable. As we kind of established at the start, you know, data quality is a problem. It can impact, you know, the quality of reporting people get, or it can cause you all sorts of regulatory headaches. Tackling it is a different thing, because it's that transition, I guess, where it stops being an IT problem, i.e. the system's either up or down, or it works or it doesn't work, and it becomes a problem for the people who are actually using it. You know, it becomes their responsibility. I can't either go out to the people in the contact centre. I can't sit and correct their data for them. There's an onus on them to actually be accountable for what they're putting into these systems and the part that it plays in producing the kind of intelligence and the data of the business. So again, in terms of tackling this, it's something that I think you can start small with. An example I use all the time is I used to work with a lady called Juliet when I worked in housing. She ran our housing support schemes, and they were all funded by the local council, so she had to do a kind of quarterly returns of how many people we'd helped and what kind of cases we'd done, that kind of thing. And naively, I just found Power BI at the time and was very excited about it. So I told her, don't worry about doing your quarterly returns, I can automate that for you. Which I did, set up this lovely thing, straight to a database, got all the data, set it up, so all she had to do was basically press a button and send it to the council. And then she pointed out that the reason it took her so long to do these returns wasn't because it was hard, it was just because the data was so bad she had to go and change it all and fix it all. But by doing that, it kind of presented an opportunity to actually introduce a bit of kind of data governance into the business, because actually you could do it at a small scale and talk to her about actually owning the quality of the data, because there was something in it for her. Basically, she could have this automation, she could have this easy solution if she worked with her team to actually help improve the quality of the data that they had. So that's kind of quality, and it links in closely to the next thing, which is data governance. So the problem with data governance, it's a hard nut to crack because it's pretty boring. I know a few people in the world who are extremely enthusiastic about data governance. In fact, I saw there's a guy on LinkedIn, Scott, I can't think of his name, Scott Taylor, it's like called the Data Whisperer, he calls himself. He's in the middle of a 26-hour data governance marathon online. I can't even imagine what that would look like. But for most people, data governance isn't an exciting subject. This is some people talking about it here. But it's really important. So what if it's boring? Financial governance isn't exciting. Does anyone get excited about seeing their company's annual accounts? Not really. Health and safety, those fire risk assessments I was talking about earlier, they're not exciting, they're not glamorous, but they're absolutely critical and you've got to have them. And data governance is no different. Yeah, it's dull and you're not going to get people kind of queuing up to get involved in it necessarily, but it's really important. Data is an asset. Going back to that analogy of it being like the new oil, data is an asset just as much as your company's money is, just as much as your buildings or your, if you bought a fleet of really high-end laptops and then didn't have something set up to be able to patch them and put security updates on them, that would be unthinkable. So why is it that data can be kind of left to rot and fester, and yet people expect miracles when it comes to kind of turning it into something useful? So again, data governance is important, and we need to tackle that. And again, it's that kind of idea of starting small. I worked with a guy at the university who came in as a consultant about this, and I kind of was like, oh, well, we could do this, and we could do this, and we could hire somebody. And he was like, yeah, but Dave, you're talking about like 3 years worth of work. It's like, no one's ever going to sign it off, and no one's ever going to put their hand in their pocket for that. Break it down into small bits, make it manageable for people. And again, it's that example like with Juliet. It's like, well, give her a solution to something that gets better and improves and benefits her by having some data governance. I kind of made her the informal data owner, and then it's like, well, actually, it's on you to talk to your staff. It's on you to make them understand why it's important that the data is good quality and it's up to date. Because then you can go and talk to people who have more kind of leverage and budget and say, well, look, I've done this kind of proof of concept almost. This is the benefit we can get if we actually start to put some of this stuff in place. And then it kind of unlocks that a little bit more. The other issue with data governance is that it is a big mountain to climb. People look at it and just walk away, basically, a bit like at the University of Bath. It was, well, it's going to take 3 years, nobody's got the headspace for it, nobody wants to invest in it. But again, it's that thing of make it valuable to people. If we can get improvements to quality, we can demonstrate improvements to quality that have a tangible outcome, like those leading indicators and things where we actually get some business benefit from it, it's more likely that people will get on board and actually recognise that investing in this stuff is going to be useful and important for the business. The last thing I just want to talk about is the other kind of element of data culture, I guess, is data literacy. There's an organisation called the Data Literacy Project, whose website I'll put up in a minute, that's really good, worth having a look at. They did a survey and found that 76% of business leaders they surveyed, I'm very conscious this all sounds a bit like the Colgate advert, by the way, but there we go. 76% of business leaders they surveyed basically aren't confident in their ability to read, work with, analyse or argue with data. And that's terrifying. That's 3/4 of all senior leaders aren't comfortable with that. That's terrifying. And actually, when you think back to some of the stuff I've talked about, it's no wonder some of this stuff is a hard sell, because who's going to put their hand in their pocket and invest in a big data governance project if actually they're not comfortable themselves with the idea of actually reading it or looking at it or understanding it? Because I guess there's always that inherent risk that it then exposes them as being unskilled or flawed in some way. So we need to try and find a way of working with people to get them to kind of get to the point where they can talk about data literacy, because it is important. So in an ideal world, what you want, I guess, is a balance of using your business experience, using kind of critical thinking, and then marrying that up with some kind of, not even being a kind of skilled statistician necessarily, but having enough understanding of how to read and interpret data that you can kind of match it with your business knowledge. The danger of not doing that is you get into the whole things of common issues like is it causation or is it correlation, that kind of thing, where people can actually go right off the rails and make some crazy decisions. I've got a couple of funny examples that I'll just share just to make that point. They are very flippant. But number of people dying of becoming tangled in the bed sheets correlates to the amount of cheese consumption. There's no causation there, but you can imagine a world where if you've got enough business knowledge and you get some stuff presented to you where it looks like there is a trend, you might make the kind of leap of logic, I guess, that isn't actually there to think that there is causation between two things if they seem kind of sensible on the surface. The list goes on. Divorce rate mainly correlates with the consumption of margarine. 99% correlation. Obviously it's a silly example, but if you didn't know better, you might see two things that you have a real life relationship and make the assumption that they are somehow one is causing the other. And then the last one, just for fun, because it always makes me chuckle, is people drowning in pools correlates with the number of films Nicolas Cage appears in any given year. Okay, so they're silly examples, but it's just to make the point that you can see something in a graph, but unless you've got a good understanding of the context around it, it can be potentially misleading and lead you to make wrong decisions and wrong assumptions about what's happening in the world. So that's where data literacy is important. I highly recommend checking out the Data Literacy Project website. It's set up by Click originally, who make the data visualization tool, but it's kind of grown into this big partnership where there's lots of materials, lots of free resources on there, which is great. But one of the things they've got that I think would be well worth a lot of organisations looking at, they do a data personas exercise. So it's a bit like if you've ever been somewhere where you do things like Myers-Briggs or insight profiles with the little blocks, basically to trigger a conversation about how different people operate and their personalities and how they communicate with each other. And the data personas is really the same kind of thing. It's not are you good or bad at working with data, it's not right or wrong, it's about kind of levels of confidence. It's questions like, when you see data, do you just see a load of numbers and are terrified, or are you comfortable and confident, or anything in between? So I think people could do a lot worse than actually trying to introduce this kind of thing into their business just to strike up a conversation. Again, it's not an accusation that people don't know what they're doing or don't know how to deal with it. It's a conversation starter to try and get people involved and engaged with the idea that actually this is a thing and it's not a given that everybody should understand how to interpret data when it's presented to them. So I'm conscious I've kind of rattled on for half an hour. So basically, the main messages to kind of take away are, there's lots of things you can do to tackle data culture, and there are lots of really good reasons for doing it. So I think fixing it is a case of, we need to help people understand why it's an issue and why it's a problem, but also what the benefits are of actually getting it right. And those benefits aren't just we get to do nice things with data, they're also about mitigating quite serious business risks and improving overall performance. So my recommendations are kind of, start small, don't go in trying to look for massive, big, costly solutions. Start small and try and chip away and build up the goodwill that will actually help get other people on board and influence the overall direction of the culture in the organisation. So that's all from me. Obviously, since we're a very small group, we can have a bit more of an informal kind of Q&A type chat, I guess. I'd be particularly interested in hearing other people's kind of views on this stuff, really. Does it kind of resonate? If you had positive or negative experiences, that kind of thing, really. So,
yeah.
What do you think is the key around data stewardship and data ownership? Because in the modern world, there are lots of systems that manipulate data, and it might not be possible to find that single owner who really can own an individual piece of master data. Is there a secret source that helps kind of find that stewardship, ownership, or tackle that stewardship and ownership conundrum?
Yeah, it's tricky, isn't it? I mean, the University of Bath had issues along those lines because we had a lot of systems that kind of were very cross-functional. So it was really hard to kind of pick one obvious name of somebody who really had oversight of that entire kind of area of the business. So it's a difficult one. I think you have to be kind of pragmatic with it, and I think there is an element where you have to accept that in terms of data ownership, you have to be fairly broad and accept that. So at the University of Bath, we had the student record system, and that covered all sorts of things because it included things like people's student finances, their accommodation, stuff like that. So we had to take a fairly broad view that actually we probably had to just pick an overall owner for that. But then I think that's where the stewardship comes in, where you've got maybe that level below, you've got somebody ultimately accountable, but then actually you can kind of break it down a little bit more and make it a little bit more granular, and find people where actually bits of data relate more specifically to particular business areas. At the university, we kind of got around it a little bit by accepting that, say, admissions, they had the first contact with students, so actually we'd make them kind of the owner of the overall student data, because actually they were the ones that were inputting most of it, so they were the ones most likely to have an influence over the quality of it, and the standard of what was going in, and they kind of understood it best. And actually they were great because they took on the mantle of proper data ownership really well. They took it seriously, they were serious about who had access and things like that. Other places, it was a bit harder. When you go into all the complication things around like retail, where you had a bit of building and a bit of assets, but you also had a bit of kind of retail management, it got a lot more blurry, but equally it kind of got down to more granular systems. So I think it's being pragmatic. Find a good kind of owner, almost at that kind of like exec sponsor level, I guess, who will accept kind of overall accountability for it, but then really just divide it up in whatever way makes sense, rather than getting really fixed on, well, this system must all be under whatever. I think it's almost an acceptance that you have to be a little bit more granular than that, in my experience.
Anybody got a question? Okay, because I've just got more of a story on just to...
Yeah.
So, okay, I'm going to probably go whittle on for a couple of minutes. 76% of senior managers aren't particularly confident with data. I don't think that figure's high enough. There's no question here, it's purely a story. A couple of years ago, one of our senior managers came to me and went, Keith, this is how you deal with senior managers. They love a picture, they love a graph, because you don't have to look at the figures. And they want the graph picture to tell them a simple story. So it is, you could just have, bar chart, small value, big value, small value. All the senior manager now has to do is decide, does he have to pat somebody on the back or kick him? And that is it. Now, I then looked at Colin, a colleague, name slipped, he's like now, and some of the things he did, to mitigate around this. So he was in charge of supplier accounts. His key performance is days purchasing outstanding. An invoice comes in for a supplier, how quickly does that invoice get paid? That's his critical function. So if he had he was below his target, he would then dream up other KPIs and put them on his chart. So, so you'd only ever have one red figure. And the senior manager come along and you grab trivial little things. He's created his own KPI, his own measures against. But you just see one red block and an outcome, and you just say, keep up the great work, go on.
Yeah.
I'm just sharing this, you get some geniuses out there.
Yeah. But that's no different, is it? I've worked in like project management before.
Yes.
You get project sponsors who, when you say, oh, we do our RAG rating for the quarter, yeah, that's fantastic. Tell us all the truth as long as it's all green.
Oh,
and it's kind of the same thing, isn't it? Of like, and the problem is it masks everything.
Yes.
Housing was exactly the same. I say we had all these weird and wonderful indicators, but they didn't show that we were actually performing well. They just showed people what they wanted to see, which was,
yes.
We could tell ourselves we were performing well and go, yeah, well done, didn't we do well? But they weren't meaningful. They didn't really. Actually, the reality was at the time we had really bad press about things like our repair service. We had all this health and safety debacle going on and stuff like that. So it just masked all of that stuff. But ultimately, it always ends up boiling up at some point and kind of kicking in the backside, really, because you can only, it stays under for so long. But eventually, some event will happen where it comes out, and then, a bit like I mentioned, our CEO ended up having to go and find a new job because it suddenly turns out that something's not been very well monitored. And all hell breaks loose. But I guess that's where the kind of automation piece comes in, because actually all the time you've got people manually going and doing this stuff. Like I say, you've got someone basically producing their own KPIs.
Yes.
I'm not looking at you, Alex.
But
it's what happens, isn't it? People will inevitably, people work to target, and people just say, well, actually, I've got the opportunity to predict it, and you kind of need to take that away, don't you, and actually make it a transparent process. And actually, really, automation is kind of the only way to do that, where people can't go and interfere and actually make those tweaks. And actually, it's crazy in that world. KPIs are KPIs. Surely somebody sanctioned them and said the measure I'm interested in is this. But like I say, if you've got a leadership team who are so ambivalent about it that they're not even looking at what he's putting in there, it's just, well, as long as most of it's green, I'm fine. Then where do you go with that, really?
I think some of these tools also, the kind of hype that gets generated, the supplier comes in and presents a solution of perfect data.
Yeah, right, yeah.
Senior leadership are all over it like a rash.
Yeah.
You implement it in your organisation, the data's terrible, and it not only damages the reputation of the tool, but the team trying to deal with it. So I think there's almost a damp down the enthusiasm.
Yeah,
It's
definitely.
about, this tool's going to solve, it's going to make a tea, it's going to solve all your data problems.
Yeah.
It's not, it's probably going to actually, I say to organisations, it's going to make it worse initially. It's going to
Yeah,
expose the
absolutely.
hidden problems you didn't know you had in your data
Yeah.
before it then makes it actionable and allows it to get better.
Yeah, and I think that's the irony, isn't it? I always used to laugh at a place I used to work before where it was always the IT team who were the ones trying to dissuade people from buying new systems. You know, everyone's like, oh, well, you guys, you always want to put new systems in, but actually it was always the senior leaders who, like you say, they'd been to a conference or they had a salesman come around and tell them this amazing thing was going to fix all of their problems. And of course, you know, it's never true, is it? Or it could be, but you have to put a lot of work in. I think people just think, oh, well, you plug it in and everything will be rosy. But like you say, if the foundations aren't there and the data's terrible, it's going to be a world of pain to start off with. So I think that's where that idea of kind of starting with small projects is better, because like you say, actually it keeps a limit. It's almost flying under the radar a little bit. You know, you get your way because you get to start implementing some change, but it doesn't get that really high level exposure where people do start thinking there's some kind of magic bullet coming on that's going to suddenly make the whole organisation kind of pivot on its axis and become this amazing utopia of data, because it's just never going to happen. But if you can do it, you can demonstrate that actually there is this pain element, but there are ways out of that pain as well, and then you can kind of build that, I guess, more realistic set of expectations about what's going to happen when you do kind of pull the trigger on the big project, that actually, you know, everyone's got to buy into it, everyone's got to be involved, everyone's got to be accountable for their own bits of it, otherwise it's just going to spit out whatever rubbish you put in at the other end. So you say you had a question?
Yes, I was going to say, fantastic presentation, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
Loads of resonating points. I didn't really like Power BI myself because we have to embed websites. It turns out it takes 2 seconds just to load on the data required to actually run the Power BI. So, but I did like it anyway. But going to my question, Sarah, I work at a company who recently bought another company, and one of the reasons we bought it was because it's so profitable and it's doing so amazing. We looked at it and gone, oh crikey, quite a lot of their things are in manual, like you say. They literally have spreadsheets with data of invoices, with invoices within those invoices, which are then correlated from invoices from other invoices.
Yeah.
And you sit there and immediately this company are just sat there putting their hands in the air and going, oh, we've been doing that for years.
Yeah. Well, that's the most terrifying thing you can ever hear, isn't it? Oh, that's how we've always done it.
Yeah. and how do you sort of tackle that head on? Like you've got this brand new company you're talking to, and trying to work out who actually has ownership, because they're just turning around and going, well, you own us now. It's your problem.
Yeah, that's so hard, isn't it? I guess, you know, culturally that's kind of a bit. I mean, well, no, that's not beyond my experience. I guess I used to, before I got into data and BI, I used to manage, do like application management, and did get involved in a few mergers where we'd have to go and kind of amalgamate, I guess, for want of a better word, systems, which was ironic because it would be exactly the same commercial system and the same name on it, but when you go to the other place, it looked nothing like, you know, that everyone used it differently, the data was horrible. But yeah, there was a lot of that, well, it's your problem now kind of thing, which is hard. But I guess it's about, you know, showing what's in it for people again. I guess it's hard when you get into takeovers and stuff, you get that attitude of people are always fearful, aren't they? You know, they're expecting, oh, someone's going to come in, they're going to automate what we do, we're not going to have a job anymore. So you get that kind of real resistance. So I guess it's, you know, as I kind of said earlier, it's all about trying to find benefits for people where there's something in it for them, because that's the only way. As soon as people see, I did a talk a few weeks ago, I talked about automation, and I kind of named notionally a couple of people who were involved in this really labour-intensive process, and somebody said at the end, it's like, yeah, but what happens to those people? And it's like, well, okay, you know, they might not have a job anymore. But I guess it's about trying to get across to people that it isn't necessarily about, well, we just want you out the door to save money. It's about, you know, if we automate this thing that's kind of low value and very transactional, it frees up your time to do something else. So I guess it's trying to find the benefit to those people in that situation where you can pitch it as well, that actually we're here to help you and enable you, not actually just kind of take this stuff away and automate it so you don't have anything to do anymore. But it's really hard because, like I say, people are so kind of fearful, and once people get into that mode, it's really hard to kind of persuade them out of it, because it's always just, oh well, yeah, well, you would say that, wouldn't you, because you've just come on, not fun.
I've never really thought about that way in terms of fearing for their own jobs, but yeah, I suppose that's actually, yeah, it's a good point.
Not just small companies either. I've seen the gentleman on your slide earlier working
Young Jeffrey.
organisation trying to plan deliveries into their DCs. Guess what? It's Google Sheets.
Yeah, totally. Doesn't matter where you go. I'd say, in fact, actually, probably the bigger the organisation, the worse it is, because it's grown up over years. You talk about maturity. Actually, the more mature notionally an organisation is, the more immature they normally are around this stuff, because it's always, well, like I say, that's how we've always done it, or, well, when there were 20 of us, a spreadsheet was all right, but now there are 5,000 of us, and so on. And people aren't very good at spotting that tipping point where you've got to go, actually, we can't just always be pushing forward. You've got to stop at some point, take stock, and change the way you actually do processes and use technology. But I say people are all bad at that, because, like I say, people see something fancy and like go running headlong towards the nice shiny lights, don't they? So,
I'm going to say that it's a fear factor. I've dealt with that, say, accounting or department for the better part 20 years, and it's, I think, 2 different companies, several different restructurings, management by business structure, management by region. Now, go back 20 years ago, you had a spreadsheet. Now, chances are it was going through several iterations. But for an accountant, that's how you did it. Then the next thing is, if we've got a restructure, you get to that spreadsheet, and then you do the restructuring on the next spreadsheet. And then every subsequent restructuring, reorganisation, you still go through the same process and then do the next couple of stages. And it is that fear factor, and come along to say, well, you could just do this instead. That's heresy.
yeah, absolutely.
Sorry, it comes across.
Well, it's like the data literacy thing. It's really hard to say to somebody the way you're doing something just isn't very good. Who wants to hear that?
Yeah.
At the end of the day, it's not a nice thing to hear, is it? So, like you said, it's about that kind of approach of trying to make it a kind of non-aggressive, actually it's here to help, it's here to try and improve things. But like I say, I know, not speaking up, so, but finance people I've worked with traditionally, like I say, they're very set in their ways around using spreadsheets, and it is well, that's how I do it.
Yes.
And it's very hard quite often to kind of budge people out. But that's no different to any other kind of area of work, I guess, is it?
I was going to say, about, again, 15 years or so ago, myself and a colleague, we looked at scanning purchase invoices, pull the metadata off, and load it into a document management system. From there, we put it into our ERP system, and then from the ERP system, once it's loaded, you could link back to the document management system. You now got the image and the ERP system, 2 separate screens. Absolutely brilliant. The managing director of the company at the time said he was not going to make anybody redundant because he wanted to see the improvement in quality, first of all, and that was probably one of the best projects I've ever worked on. As a consequence, just that. And that was around about 2007, 2008. We were taken over by Heidelberg Cement. And for 3 or 4 years after we were taken over, that link between our ERP system and the document management system had to be in place. And for me, it was about 20 lines of DOS code. It really was crappy technically, but everybody loved it.
Yeah. That's a great way to pitch it, though, isn't it? That actually it's about the quality.
Yes.
It's not about bottom line, because as soon as you say bottom line, everybody's like, oh, that includes my salary.
Yeah.
So these things
Together,
could pitch on something different.
Then he said if he wanted to see the improvement in quality, this would allow his staff to tackle the crappy invoices, the stuff that we haven't got at CRM yet, the stuff that's been there for several months. Why have we not paid it yet?
Yeah, well, it's the stuff that needs human intervention,
Yeah.
isn't it? It's, automation is great, but it still needs kind of supervision, and it still needs, like I say, it frees up time to fix the exceptions and the anomalies and things like that. So
Yeah, no, I'm allowed to speak. It's very difficult with Keith in the room to get a word in edgeways. No, I was just going to say, I had a sort of dancing conversion to the exploitation of data about 20 years ago when I came across W. Edwards Deming, the system of profound knowledge, and specifically looking at data in its historic context to work out whether your current reading was inside a natural process limit or outside. And if it was inside, you didn't worry about it. So,
Yeah.
if it was outside, then that was something to look at. So, for instance, if we measured the time that we took to drive to work each day, there's a natural variation in the process, and you don't make any decisions on your route based on the time it took today versus the time it took yesterday, because when you plot all these things out, if you apply the sort of statistical process control, you actually see the mean and the upper and lower natural process limits. If there was a set of roadworks suddenly appeared and your time shot up, it would be outside the mean, it would be a special cause. And I found far too many people react to common cause rather than special cause. And the chief culprits I found are financiers, because they'll look at last year's figure this month against this month's figure, and this month's figure against last month's figure, and make a gut reaction. Whereas if you, because financial process is a process, so statistical variation ought to apply to it. Whereas if you can look at the figures in context, you actually make the right decision. And I can't let Keith get away with telling a war story without telling one of mine. I was trying to convince an organisation that I was working with of the value of looking at data in its historic context and working out the process limits, and they were not particularly convinced. So I said, well, is there any data you can give me that I can go away and play with? And they said, well, okay, what about our acquisition process? Because they had a process where they got authorised demanders, and the authorised demanders were allowed to, this was against government finance space, they were allowed to obviously put in a demand, and what the system was finding was that quite a lot of these demands were incorrect. So they actually hired a bunch of highly paid consultants to become what was called a requisition gate. And every single requisition had to go through the requisition gate, and the requisition gate folks actually detected the ones that were wrong before they actually got out into the wild. So what I got was the percentage of requisitions over, I think it was a 3-year period, percentage of requisitions that had failed going through the requisition gate. So I plotted these month by month on a run chart. And it was quite interesting, because I said to him, can you see, okay, you've got a mean of about 68% requisitions over the year, well, over the year to May. That's the mean, and there's a natural variation. And then the number of requisitions between May and October, the mean went down to about 45%. So I said, did you ever know this? And they said, no, we've never seen it like that. I said, well, what do you think is happening? And with a bit of coaxing, they decided that was the period when the authorised demanders were on holiday. And, well, the proportion of them were. And therefore it was the deputy authorised demanders who did the demands. And they were even worse at doing their demands than the authorised demanders. And then back in November time, the thing exploded. But the really interesting thing was, after 2.5 or 3 years, paying a great deal of money to these high-priced consultants who ran the requisition gate, the mean was exactly the same. There'd been no improvement at all in the number of correct demands that were put in. And I just found it incredible that nobody had actually learned from looking at that data.
Yeah, it was funny, isn't it? People are really bad at measuring change. Again, it's another great use of data, but people just don't do it very often.
Yeah.
And I know, like Six Sigma is a bit kind of corny, isn't it, with like black belts and green belts and all that kind of stuff. But actually, a big part of that is all about measuring change. It's like benchmark it before, measure it again afterwards, and keep measuring it. Because otherwise, actually, people just assume, don't they? Well, my project went live, so therefore it's a success. But actually, success is, like you say, 2 years down the line, has there been an overall improvement in the thing that you're actually trying to change in the first place? That ignores all of those kind of localized, kind of temporal changes, I guess. In it as well. But I say organisations are terrible at doing that, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean the old adage is not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted.
Yeah.
Okay. So, thanks for the excellent presentation, some interesting questions as well. So thank you, just a small token of appreciation from the branch. Just within all compliance limits.
Thank you, that's very kind.
It's built for the sandwich.
Yes. I had a few crisps in fairness.
I love it.
Absolutely, yeah. Take some sandwiches. Thank you.
Thank you for having us as well.
Yeah, so thank you very much for the energy invested. Yeah. I'm just sorry there weren't more arms on the seats.
That's fine.
I was going to say as well, several years ago, we implemented SAP. It wasn't like water, it sets like concrete. And it is, if your master data is wrong, all sorts of IT euphemism, unexpected results will be yielded.
No, I'm right.
So I thought, okay, we'll take the master data out, extract it, put it into a reporting database. If you know we've got an issue with this piece of master data, for example, you can't pay vendor via banks if they do not have a UK address. So if it's even though they've got a UK operation, if they're expected to be paid in the French HQ, you can't pay them by banks.
Right, okay.
So what about the if you set a vendor up to pay by banks,
Second key, yes.
find the other web vendors, so you can then pick up other instances where it's going wrong.
I think search provider or search.
Every week, fill up the data.
Search selling
here's your
providers.
reports.
They don't make them, they sell
It doesn't
them.
get used.
But
You get new master data
yeah,
manager,
the
say,
properties.
tell them about it.
So yeah,
You've got all
I'm
of these
the head of R&D, so
Based in
Sweden, yeah. Fully working from home now, thanks to
Yeah, that's been a process, hasn't it, for everybody to make this new normal work for us.
It has opened our horizons for more developers, but
Sadly,
I think if anything, it's actually now hindrance to market because
big red font, so
now we're competing
typically the only way they respond.
and the prices actually drop.
Yeah, I work with an organisation for developers in Romania.
Could have stopped this happening.
Even more so than
I had to Bristol, but really nice to
I truly appreciate it. No idea what was going to happen tonight. There were more, trust me, there were already stuff. You had no idea what was going to happen.
it's still good to do. We want to get more.
where I was at the time, there was
Thing
a
is,
conference and we
if
just
you guys do something else, I'd like to get involved.
got jobs going.
Yeah, in the future we'd love to do
It's really these things. Once we get momentum going and other people coming up, we'll get back in touch if you're happy to come again. And
They're still
more
hiring
people.
people who notice because the timeline of
Much
the
more
issue.
because this is.
we're not trying to follow the sun.
No, I heard the name.
I could. You might have to talk to Dave though.
They don't
He'll
use it.
be there.
Yeah.
He'll be talking about zero.
Yeah.
You don't have to ask me.
We were over to
And the other thing is, well, like,
But they weren't
used
going to
to
hire people who went to
we had
UK
somebody that
with
shipping
roles because there weren't any
There's
go.
the vulture opposite.
I suppose the funding is done
So we did have a couple of meetings on there. So things were covered, you guys trust us to do it.
Yes, sorry, I'll get the
I am more than happy to do that. I've no idea what's going to happen, but I want to find out. That's my it's one of these things.
We did have
you find that there's no use for that.
we did have a branch
But you never
in
know
the
until
until
you
the pandemic.
So
very properly spun down again.
I don't want to put you through something similar again. Just to get
Yeah,
absolutely.
If I'm being honest, as long as not meaning to. I've always found it really weird.
I'm not sure.
Wilderness of developers out there.
It's finance.
You
Where
I
are you
just
on
can't
this
believe
rank?
the
I
things that
haven't
just
seen it.
come out all of a sudden we've been able to start promoting.
Yeah, have you seen it? Or I've had one today. We've seen it. I've actually done a graduate, junior, senior, and a normal cadet who I've had. And it's just how on each of them because we've got a deadline by the week.
99%.
And it's surprising. The graduate asked as many questions, which I thought so fairly.
It is. You're not seeing it.
And it was because they didn't introduce new language and new technology, and
We have to give them a lot of
replace them in their knowledge of their work.
We did
It's just more horrendous. And that was it.
I guess they're going to market us as all fantastic products.
But not really.
Perhaps fixing that for their
Teachers are paying. I usually just give them the rebate. It's the same as last month, it'll be all right.
Let's hope that's right. Isn't it?
I openly said I don't know React. I started learning React back in December. But I've only had about maybe a week of learning.
They'll be selling
I know I pick up languages well.
CDs with
Yeah, it's true. It's also designed to take the companies.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, they didn't believe it. If I watch an hour-long course on React
It's not even in your
for a few weeks, I'm like,
It is a minefield, but like, if you want to try it,
Well, I volunteer for the branch,
yeah.
so
I think I have my last time in.
so part of the voluntary
When I
system
started,
too.
another 14.
you're actually.
But most of the stuff I do is
Cyber
translation
forensics.
change consulting.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
Well, the other,
I can find my way
Yeah, so I
around.
commuted in, only live in Hull, so
Developing
I'm
language,
not
Kubernetes and what have you, but I'm not.
yeah,
which
really
I
interesting.
religiously
But I
before,
think they
I always
realised
taught
probably want to work in private.
That's a swear word these days.
And I had a couple of
It's
cars.
a big
After
driving
seeing all
thing.
the
Oh,
red
let's
tape.
abstract all of the data, all of the actual
And suddenly
system
noticed
requirements
that
into
there was
a single cluster and throw it off into the internet and just put it. How is it
Okay.
How do we do it? We managed to hit something which I have worn
the turbo
some of the decisions
into
many
one
on it,
that had a
which
stone
was
strip.
we actually bottled
So
the
I'd not noticed the
physical
occasional
request. We actually reached the capacity of how many physical
Great
requests,
smoke.
not payload.
in the mirror.
Physical requests we actually made. We actually managed to crash our phonetics with
But actually, I was able
because
to
we're
put
obsessed with
that
microservices.
Yeah.
So when you have nowadays there's a few hundred microservices all talking to each other.
Boarding scale.
So you can actually distribute now. I think the idea is to try and
Wow.
either reduce the amount of calls
Yeah.
as an emergency sort of thing,
Oh, it is.
distribute it.
Oh, yeah.
I'm the same.
Yeah.
I'm just Nirvana, because we also actually do private device. And too many that talk about bandwidth.
It takes them 6 months to get
Sure.
through.
How far the test
Something else. That's completely irrelevant.
the upper bounds of it modest in terms of their potential scale requirements. It's quite alarming.
Yeah.
We all look at sort of different
I feel like some of these languages have been picked up so rapidly. This is amazing, this is good. Because like 2 years ago, Kubernetes was even something unheard of.
No.
Well, no, it's interesting.
Well,
There's loads of rules about it.
Yeah.
It's all kind of interrupted for half an hour.
But it is things that kind of
I talked
Give me
to
some-
Yeah, no, I
Like
get that,
services,
Joe.
containerisation,
I know.
you know,
I
data, moving away from relational data
Soft
to
systems
data's
methodology.
fine, but it's an uncharted world to a certain degree. And as you say, very
Yeah.
junior.
Yeah.
Spot on. Within 20
Because
years.
I'm
You go first.
I don't worry about those things, somebody else can worry about that.
Look at that, tight says, I just took one car, still got one car,
I do wish
What's the
universities
scam
would
is?
cover things out
to send a lorry
and
and
actually
overweight
teachers and undergrads. So
under.
Oh, the headlines, you know, make 100 grand a year. And
But it's, I guess
Few
I
months.
still don't know what it is, but it is working out the scam behind the scenes.
Mm-hmm.
right,
And
I need to make
or
a
behaviour as well.
Yeah. 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 Okay. You're not gonna grab a snack or anything?
No, I'm alright actually. I have crisps.
Oh, that's
I had protein bar food.
Oh, okay.
Opportunity to not have a whole big meal like I in the evening, so it's probably not going to do me any harm.
when you're leading training things, I've always a perfect example in the whole really now to say it. You know how during the pandemic they stopped, or pretty much all sales properties dropped, and they had to introduce stamp duty. My company failed to realise that with stamp duty being free and there being a massive dip in the market, we were all screaming at them. There's going to be a massive surge in houses being bought.
Yeah,
Completely ignored it.
yeah. It's crazy, isn't it? Because it seems so obvious on the face of it, but like I say, people just view these things in different ways, don't they? And it's kind of a total blind spot for other people that you might be able to actually predict these things and anticipate.
Well, all you always got to do is think back to 1987. That was when was the Maya tax relief on the first. I used to get tax relief on the first £30,000 of a mortgage.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Now that used to be per person, and then it was changed to per household. So what that meant is, round about 1987, or the run up to April 1988, you got complete strangers. Then just said, well,
Moving. Yeah.
you buy a house together.
Yeah.
You share. And I get beautifully later. First job was down working in St Albans. Met a lot of people who had bought houses on this tax exemption scheme, and by this stage, even with about 18 months of buying a house, had fallen out.
Yeah. So it's quite brave.
But they paid well over the odds because of the tax relief, but that couldn't get out the mortgage or couldn't get out the house that they just wanted to be in.
Yeah, I think that's a brave commitment to make, isn't it? 25-year mortgage or something for a random stranger. Tax relief is great.
But it's all of a sudden you get it changes stamp duty, etc. Certainly on house prices, all of a sudden it's just, I've got to buy a house.
Yeah.
Unexpected consequences.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Nowhere, even the local authorities, completely flabbergasted. They're still recovering today, a year on.
Yeah, it's crazy, isn't it? I mean, yeah. I say, well, there's no things like that. Health and safety side, so yeah, it just your mind boggles that it's possible, but you say loads of people just like blissfully kind of carry on and ignore what seems to be patently obvious to other people. But yeah, that's people, isn't it? I guess.
Yeah.
But you just, I guess it's that thing like in businesses and things like that. You just kind of assume that people put some of that stuff. My old boss used to always say, "Oh yeah, half the people here leave their brain at the door when they walk in," and it's like. There is an element of truth in that, isn't there? Because you'd think people would actually want to go and kind of do the right thing and actually think through these things, but people get really fixated on, well, no, this is my area of the world. The blinkers are on, that's all I'm going to look at, and actually it doesn't bother me what happens anywhere else.
Nobody ever gets sacked for following the process.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
Keep your head down.
Yeah.
The other one as well, I always look at this. First job I had in life school was in a berry factory, berry processing factory. Dundee, where I grew up, a lot of strawberry, raspberry crops growing locally. My friend Steve, who is the most idle git I have ever met.
I'm sure he speaks highly of you as well, Keith.
Now senior partner in a law firm in Dundee.
Oh, yeah.
So probably idly suited for his job.
All about billable hours,
But this is the only time I ever saw Steve work hard, was you froze black currants. And you had this automated machine that picked black currants off the bushes, but in picking the black currants, it took leaves, twigs, etc. So they would then just be frozen, and then you put, once they were frozen, you then put them through a machine that broke them down into the black currants again. You blew air, and you forced them to the side of this drum, and forced the twigs and the leaves away from the black currants. Steve was told, don't put too many black currants through this machine. And the minute we floated with the production managers, that was fun.
Yeah, there's always one, isn't there? How quickly can I break this thing? Yeah.
There is smoke billowing out the...
Did it work then, yeah?
It's only just started.
Okay.
It's the only time you see somebody work hard is when you could cause destruction to the organisation you're working for. And it's, you have to realise that when you go to work thinking, trying to do the best, improve things, etc.
Can we